Watson, and welcome to this edition of iiaa Live. Today we have another in-depth look at how skincare professionals can prevent or treat ageing skin. In this programme we look specifically at sunscreens. For years the conventional wisdom has been to wear sunscreen, especially in the middle of the day when the sun is at its strongest, to protect our skin from burning and of course the risk of cancer. However, despite increased awareness of the benefits of using sun creams and ever higher SPF ratings, we are still seeing a rise in skin cancers. Add to this the confusing labelling that tells us little about the actual protective benefits of sunscreens, and we inevitably end up with the question, the role of sunscreens in anti-aging, curse or cure? Giving us the facts today are Professor Anthony Young from King's College London. Professor Young chairs the British Photodermatology Group and is a faculty member of the American Academy of Dermatologists. Following on will be a panel discussion, and Professor Young will be joined by Dr. Des Fernandez, plastic surgeon and expert on the benefits of vitamin A and antioxidants.
In this part of the programme, I'm going to be talking about sunscreens, how they're assessed and the benefits they have. What I show you here is an advertisement from 1937 for a product called Ombre Solaire. That would have had a sun protection factor of about 2 if they were lucky. And the message here was that if you didn't use the sunscreen, you were fish white, as in avant, and après, you were a nice golden brown. And that was the fashion of the time. And that's been the case for a long time. But we more and more have the idea of sunscreens as being agents for protection rather than for tanning today. So what are sunscreens? They're chemicals that absorb and or reflect solar ultraviolet radiation. And they're assessed by the sun protection factor. That's an international way of assessing their efficacy. And this SPF is a measure of the ability to prevent erythema or sunburn that's mostly caused by the UVB, the small UVB content of sunlight. Now, the SPF per se gives you no quantitative information on UVA protection. Sunscreens do have UVA protection, but the SPF doesn't tell you anything about it. There's been a trend over the last, let's say, couple of decades for increasing UVA protection, and sunscreens have indicators of UV protection. What you see here is the absorption profile of different sunscreens. On the left, you see the UVB part of the spectrum. On the right, the UVA. And the vertical scale is how much UV they absorb. And if we take, for example, the green line, that's a sunscreen that's absorbing mostly in the UVB part of the spectrum, whereas if you look at the purple line, that has got better UVA protection. We still don't really know which is best, I would say, but there is a trend towards more UVA protection, such as you see with the purple line on that graph there. There are different international ways of assessing UVA protection, and they're shown on this slide. I don't need to go into any detail, but the European Union, the UK, and the USA have different ways of assessing UVA protection, and they're indicated on the products themselves. How do you choose a sunscreen? Well, the most important priority is the sun protection factor. And the problem people have with sunscreens is they don't apply them properly, so they don't get the proper SPF. Typically, people apply at about 1/3 of the thickness that the SPF is tested under. To compensate for this, you can use a lower SPF, let's say 15 or 20 correctly, or use a very, very high SPF 50 plus normally. You won't get 50 plus if you use it normally. You might get 15. So you have those two options. And it's important to use sunscreens to prevent sunburn. And by sunburn, I mean even if you turn slightly pink, because that pinkness is a sign of inflammation and damage of the skin. It's now well established that sunscreen use reduces skin cancer risk from studies in Australia, and those same Australian studies have recently shown that sunscreen use can prevent photoaging, which you've heard about in previous programs. The second priority in a sunscreen is UVA protection, and you want a broad spectrum sunscreen, and in the UK, these are often indicated by the STAR system. The higher the STAR rating, the greater protection, and the higher star rating is 5-star. The issue that people have with sunscreens is they don't apply them properly. And here we see a typical man, if such a thing exists, a typical woman, and you can see the body surface area of the man is about 2 square meters. In a woman, it's 1.6 square meters. Now, if you're on a beach holiday and you want to use sunscreens properly, let's say 3 applications per day, a woman will need approximately 100 grams of sunscreen. That's a bottle about that size. And a man will need a bit more, perhaps 115 grams. And if you apply the sunscreen properly at that kind of quantity, you will get really good protection. You will more or less get the SPF on the label, but people just don't do that. And I can show this on this graph here. Look at application density versus sun protection factor. The SPF is determined at an application density of 2 milligrams per centimeter squared. If you make it thicker, the SPF goes up, but if you use it at less than 2, and people use it at, for example, 0.5 or 0.7 milligrams per centimeter squared, you get much, much less protection. And that's the main problem with sunscreens. People just don't use enough of them. Just a slight aside, but certainly we have heard already about sunbeds, and they're very popular, but sunbeds do cause melanoma, which is the least common type of skin cancer, but it is far the most aggressive, and in fact, most skin cancer deaths are caused by melanoma. And we know this from studies in which people have looked at the incidence of melanoma in sunbed users and those who don't use sunbeds. Typically, you do something called a meta-analysis, and this is one published in 2006 by the International Agency for Cancer Research. This shows 7 studies of people using sunbeds under 35 years of age. And on the bottom scale, you see the relative risk, and each yellow dot represents a different study. But if you average the relative risk, that is 1.75. What that means is if you use a sunbed and you're under the age of 35 years, you increase your risk of melanoma 1.75 times, and that is a very significant increase. Sunbeds are used to encourage tanning, and you see on the left a section of skin that has a tan with the pigment on the bottom part of the epidermis. Now, a sunlight-induced tan, which is primarily a UVB-induced tan, does give you protection against sunburn, also against DNA damage. And that will give you a protection factor, some protection factor of approximately 3 to 4. But a UVA tan gives you little or no protection. A UVA tan is almost entirely cosmetic. What about vitamin D? It is the main, the sun, especially UVB, is the main source of vitamin D for most people. You can get it from the diet, you can get it from supplementation, but most of us get it from the sun. And that comes from the UVB component. But UVB is also the main source of DNA damage, sunburn, and skin cancer, and certainly UVB will contribute to photoaging. Vitamin D is essential for bone health, and there's lots of evidence that vitamin D is important for other health benefits, but many people query that evidence. And I did a study a few years ago where we showed that sunscreen use still allows good vitamin D production. You can use your sunscreen properly, you can prevent sunburn, and you can still get a good level of vitamin D. Here's a study that I did in Poland on the Baltic Sea with a group of children, and that was in 2009. They spent 10 days on the Baltic Sea. You can see them enjoying the sun there. And we measured their vitamin D status before and after the holiday. The orange dots there represent a child before the holiday, and the green dots after the holiday. And with one exception, they all had an increase in vitamin D, and that increase was very significant. And that shows you that a short time in the sun can give you, a short holiday can boost your vitamin D status very significantly. What we see here is the effect of sunscreen use on vitamin D. And we had 4 groups in this study. The group on the right, this was done with Polish volunteers, stayed in Poland during March. And groups A, B, and C used different sunscreens, and without going into the details, all had a very, very significant increase of vitamin D in that 1 week. So you can use a sunscreen and you can still get a good level of vitamin D status. Now, the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, called NICE, is considering guidelines to advise people and the public at large, but also health professionals, in terms of what do you do about getting safe sun. And I think there are various factors that you can pick up from these guidelines. One is to identify at-risk groups. For example, those with fair skin. Children and young people are also susceptible to sunburn, and there's evidence that sunburn in childhood causes melanoma in the future. And I think we have to consider balanced sun exposure, and that also depends on individual circumstances. For example, if you're fair-skinned or if you're dark-skinned, whether you work outdoors, and various other factors. But the important message to get across is good photoprotection. Clothing is very effective, especially hats. Sun avoidance is important, especially during peak hours when the sun is at its highest, because that's when you've got the most UVB content. But also sunscreens play a very important role. And I think sunscreens do have a major role. Often they do not seem to work as well as they should, but that is because people don't use them properly. But if they use them properly, then they will certainly get the benefits. So future research, what do I consider is important? I've already said that the sun causes a lot of DNA damage to the skin. And we all have very active DNA repair systems. Some people have a genetic disorder called XP. They lack this DNA repair capacity, and their risk of skin cancer is at least 1,000-fold greater than normal. Now, there's emerging evidence that UVA inhibits the DNA repair machinery. That's still very, very preliminary. But if that is the case, I think it encourages us to seek better UVA protection, because we want to keep that machinery active, that repair machinery active, because that's what protects us from skin cancer and, I think, skin aging. So in my view, there needs to be more research that may lead to an understanding for the need for better UVA protection. As I said earlier, we don't really fully understand the benefits of UVA protection. I believe they exist, but I think they need to be demonstrated. And I thank you for your time.
Chaps, I just wanted to start with quite a shocking statistic. According to Cancer Research UK, malignant melanoma incidence rates in Britain have more than quadrupled over the last 30 years. So given that we've got an increased use of sunscreens, you know, there's far better education around using them. Why is it that we still have this increased cancer rate situation? What's going on?
I think one of the main reasons for that is more leisure in terms of people seeking short-term holidays for a week or 10 days in a sunny place. We did a study recently where we looked at a group of Danish holidaymakers, and Danes have a very high rate of skin cancer too. And in that 1 week in March in Tenerife, they got over 40% of their annual UVR exposure. And burning is a risk factor for melanoma. So I think that may be one reason. And the other point in reference to the sunscreens is that there are studies that show that sunburn is associated with sunscreen use because people aren't using them properly. They think they've got an SPF 20 or 30. In reality, they've got an SPF of 3 or 4, badly applied, and so they get burnt with a false sense of security, and it boils down to the point I was making about using the sunscreen properly. In one other study we did, if we gave people specifically measured amounts of sunscreen and told them to use that every day, they got no burn at all. And the holidaymakers came up to me and said, "What's this fantastic product? We've been on holiday before and we've always got burnt. This time we didn't get burnt." And I said, "It's a decent enough product, it's a good product, but the reason you haven't burnt is because you've used it properly." And that was as simple as that.
Gosh, that's extraordinary, really. So even though we're aware of using sunscreens, we're just simply not using them properly and holidaying more.
Typically, you should use it at 2 milligrams per centimetre squared. Studies show that people use a quarter or a third of that.
So we're just not using enough?
No, we don't use enough. Yes.
Gosh, okay, interesting. Can you just explain why the SPF ratings are misleading? I mean, you know, I think I know a fair amount about sunscreens. I would go on holiday and probably use 30 plus, but I know nothing really about what the SPF rating actually means.
Okay, the SPF is simply a measure of the ability of a sunscreen to prevent sunburn. It doesn't matter whether it's caused by UVA or UVB, although it's mostly UVB that causes sunburn. If I get a sunburn, let's say in Florida during the day, something like 85% of that sunburn will be caused by the 5% UVB. So it's important to protect against that UVB. The SPF it's taken a long time for these methods to get harmonized, and that hasn't yet happened internationally with UVA. And there's a tendency now, the only legal requirement is for sunscreens to protect against erythema or sunburn and to have a given level of UVA protection depending on which part of the world you are. But there's a tendency now, and I've been involved in some of this work, for companies to provide evidence that sunscreens can protect some of the molecular damage, such as DNA damage, such as the expression of genes that are responsive to damage, and companies are beginning to take note of that. But it'll take a while, I think, before that works its way through the market, and whether it will ever be a legal requirement or not is another matter. But companies will work to the legal requirements that they have to satisfy.
So should we be remembering that UVA is aging, UVB is burning?
I don't think so. I personally think that UVB does most of the damage. The reason for better UVA protection has been driven by the fact that when you use a high SPF, that is mostly UVB protection, you reduce the amount of UVB that you're getting, but you're getting, because of that, more UVA.
Right.
Now, that UVA won't cause you a sunburn, but there's concern that the repeat exposure to high doses of UVA over a long time may cause skin cancer and also may cause photoaging. So that's the concern about UVA. It's the longer-term effects rather than the short-term effects, which are obvious from burning with UVB.
So actually there's quite a lot to consider,
There's
isn't
a lot
there?
to consider, yes.
So what factor should we all be wearing?
I think, that will, of course, depend on where you are in the world. But if you've gone off to a sunny holiday, I think you probably need a real sun protection factor of, let's say, 20 to 30. That is a real protection factor. If you buy a 20 to 30 and apply it the way most people do, they'd be lucky to get a 3 or a 4. So they need to use a 50 plus to get probably a 15 if they're lucky, if they don't use it properly. In other words, if I use a sunscreen the way most people use it and it's 50 plus, I will not get 50, I may get 10, 15 in terms of SPF.
That is incredible.
And that's the point about applying enough.
Gosh, that really is incredible because, I've just come back from a holiday in the Balearics, a very, very strong sun, and I was thinking, 25, I'll be absolutely fine. But you're saying in reality...
Well, it's fine if you apply it properly, but
which
you
I won't
probably
be.
didn't do.
Yeah, no, of course. Gosh, that is extraordinary. Yeah. So, Des, tell me, are sunscreens harmful at all?
I don't think they're harmful. I think that they've saved a lot of people's lives. There's been a lot of concern about what are the long-term effects of absorbing the sunscreens. There's been research work to indicate that we might be exposed to more free radicals when we absorb the sunscreen ingredients, and then the ingredients are then damaged by UV rays inside the skin. But I think the weight of the evidence is that we should use a sunscreen.
Yeah.
And at this stage, my personal belief is that we shouldn't use sunscreens in excessive doses.
And yet, Anthony, you're saying we don't use enough. So how's a simple lady like me supposed to make sense of this? What?
Well, I didn't finish. Because I believe that the inclusion of free radical scavengers into a sunscreen becomes a very important way of keeping your skin healthy.
So it's about using the right sunscreen, is that right?
I would say that, yes. And using it properly.
Okay, so using the correct one,
and that's
using
why,
it properly, using enough.
And that's why for your weekend trip to the Balearic Islands, you carry your hand luggage filled with sunscreen.
I just say, Des, I'm never going on holiday with you.
Could I just add a comment to that? But sunscreens have been shown to damage the environment.
Oh,
Huge
really?
amounts of sunscreens are washed up and they damage coral reefs. And there is some interest in looking for natural products. And for example, corals make their own sunscreens, but they haven't really been tried on humans yet. And that's something I'm working on.
Well, this is interesting because I was going to lead on to, is there an alternative to these chemicals? So, Anthony, tell me more about that.
Many organisms that live in the sea produce natural sunscreens. At least that's what these chemicals are suspected of being. They're produced by small organisms and they work their way up the food chain. You find them in fish eggs, fish eyes, octopus eyes, fish skin. And it's thought that they offer protection from UV damage to animals that live quite close to the surface, and indeed plants. And so these are biocompatible, and there is just research starting to use these as possible alternatives to sunscreens. And also, some of these sunscreens are not only sunscreens, but they're also antioxidants. So you kill two birds with one stone if we can get these to a developmental stage.
Are you telling me you're about to annihilate the coral reef and all the fish?
No, I'm not telling you that at all.
So research is starting on decent alternatives.
Yes.
We have got some questions from the audience. We have one specifically about Environ, actually, Des. And if sunscreen is so important, and in particular, SPF 50 plus, why is it that Environ haven't actually produced such a product yet?
Okay, well, Environ's product is very different from the average sunscreen because not only do we include in it UVA, UVB sunscreens, but we also include in it antioxidants. So we have, for example, the vitamin C that we include in that, the vitamin E, and these are in high doses.
Right.
So now, when you make a cream, you only have a certain bit that you can put the ingredients into, because, as was said earlier, most of it is water. And then, well, you could have an oil that has a bit of water, but these are very sticky sunscreens and most people don't want them. But so you have something like 20%, 25% maximum that you can fit in besides the water, because water is 75%. And if you're asking me if I would rather have a higher sunscreen or higher antioxidants, I'm going to choose the antioxidants any day, because I have tested mine and specifically the Environ formulas and asked all the dermatologists in town to rate the SPF value, and they always overrated it. So despite when I was working with an SPF of 4, I was told that the results were similar to an SPF of 15. So from my point of view, the clinical experience of using antioxidants far outweighs the reliance, the protection that you get from just relying on sunscreens. And if I made an SPF of 50, there wouldn't be any room in the cream for the antioxidants.
Can we just discuss the vitamin D paradox? Now, I really want you chaps to explain this to me, because we need sun exposure in order to make vitamin D, and yet too much sun exposure causes cancer. So how are we supposed to balance this, particularly in the UK, Anthony?
I would say that you do not need a lot of UVB exposure to make an adequate amount of vitamin D. Probably it is best to get that at noon, because that's when you get the highest amount of UVB to UVA. And the general recommendation, which I would go along with more or less, I think, is 5 to 10 minutes exposure every other day or every few days over a modest body surface area is enough. And exposing more body surface area does give you more, but it's not proportional. If I do a study, in fact, which I've done, I increase the body surface area 20-fold, but the vitamin D only goes up twice.
Right.
So there's not a straightforward relationship between body surface area and increase in vitamin D. So I think the important message is, in the sun, don't burn. Get your sun, but get enough so that it's a sub-burning dose, and even that's pinkness. And if you do that, you will almost certainly produce enough vitamin D.
So we're going into autumn
Yes.
now in the UK, so clearly we're going to be covered up.
Yes.
You're saying go out at midday, but how much should I be
I
exposing?
think that if you were to expose arms, face, back of hands, maybe legs, that would be enough to keep you okay.
I'm in the autumn, Anthony.
No, but the point is that, and there's only a time of year, because the amount of UVB depends on the height of the sun. So the sun has to be at a certain height before you can produce vitamin D. So you build up your stocks basically during late spring up until late summer, and those stocks more or less last you, I mean, you'll probably become insufficient, as it's called, towards late in the year, early in the next year. Then you might need supplementation or improve it with diet. But the vitamin D status is cyclical depending on the weather. And if you get up to a good level, then you will more or less hold through.
So you can boost it with supplementation then?
Yes, you can boost it with supplementation. But the thing is that most of the health benefits attributed to vitamin D have come from epidemiology. In other words, you look at a relationship, and often they've not measured they've not measured the vitamin D. They've used surrogates like latitude or sun exposure as a surrogate for vitamin D status. So that suggests that vitamin D is important for a range of skin cancers or immunological disorders. But when they've tried supplementation studies to say you can have vitamin D in a safe way without any sun, and they've boosted the vitamin D status of the supplements, and then they've looked for the health benefits, by and large, those studies have been disappointing.
Oh, really?
So it may be that you need UV-induced vitamin D plus other chemicals to get the benefits. That's something that is undergoing work, it's being researched at the moment.
But generally speaking then, as sort of general advice, you
Yeah.
would say sun exposure and supplement towards the end of the year.
I would say that, yes.
Certainly in this country.
Yes.
You're all right, Des. I think you're going to be okay in South Africa, but over here, we need all the help we can get. Does vitamin D help prevent melanoma?
I think that would be a difficult question to answer, because there are different studies giving different results. And, you could also show that vitamin D status as a surrogate for other health activities. For example, physical exercise, and more likely to be outside. So it's quite difficult to unpick those things. But there is some evidence that it is beneficial for melanoma. However, the thing is that the risk factors for melanoma in terms of the sun are intermittent high-dose exposure. I was just talking to Des, and he was saying that farmers don't get melanoma because they have constant, depending on the country, low-level exposure. They get other types of skin cancer which are less serious. But a very high risk group for melanoma is airline pilots. And that's probably because they are taking short breaks, in nice places, and they get sunburn.
So we're coming back to what you were saying at the very beginning of the discussion, that those sort of short, sharp shocks of being out in the sun, very bright sun, is actually not good for you at all.
And I go back to my study with my Danish colleagues. If you get over 40% of your annual UV exposure in a week, that is not, I think, something we've evolved to deal with, basically. And everybody, if you don't guide them on sunscreen use in those studies, every single person gets a sunburn.
That's a very good point. And actually, to round up this discussion, how would you be guiding potential clients? What would you be saying to people, Des, in terms of exposure to the sun and the use of sun creams?
This is where I like to preach what I call sensible sun exposure. Tell people, don't go out into the sun till you get burned. As a matter of fact, I believe that you just have to be in the sun for half the time it takes you to go pink to make your vitamin D.
So limit your time in the sun,
Yes.
and certainly use an SPF?
Then, yes, use an SPF, but particularly use vitamin A.
Use vitamin A. We're coming back to vitamin A again, aren't we? Okay. So, and Anthony, what would you be
I
saying
think
to
that
clients?
the thing that is most important is your skin type. If you're a redhead with freckles, you're going to burn very easily. If you've got a Mediterranean complexion, you're much more tolerant of the sun. So that's important. And if you know that you burn easily, limit your exposure or use a very high SPF. You will still need a bit of exposure to get your vitamin D. If you have got a darker skin or a skin that tans very easily, you can tolerate much more. Your risk of skin cancer is much lower. Your risk of sunburn is much lower. And you can stay out longer, and you probably don't need such a high SPF.
So really, you're saying common sense.
Common sense is very important, but often in short supply.
Yes, of course. but common sense,
Yes.
albeit in short supply. Don't do the short, sharp shock of just going somewhere hot for a week and burning. And if you're going to use, of course you must use your SPF, but use it correctly.
Yes. Just a comment. I think a lot of people, when they go on a holiday, they want evidence that they're going to tan, and they see the burn as the evidence.
Yeah.
The reality is that if you have a short holiday, you're not going to start tanning till after about 5 or 6 days.
Right.
But people mix. I've had people say, look, I've got a tan, and I press, and it goes white. And I say, no, you've got a sunburn. When I press the skin, the blood goes away. That's not a tan.
Interesting. Chaps, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. That was fascinating. I do have some more questions, actually. Why is the star rating not on Environ SPS, presumably because you don't include it?
Well, the basic reason was explained. There's no harmonization of the SPF rating, UVA rating, and we export to the same product to very many different parts of the world, which have different rating systems. So we have chosen not to put on a rating system on the boxes. Very often in some countries, you can't have 2 rating systems on the same box.
And Anthony, what is the study called that shows wearing an SPF can still stimulate vitamin D?
Well, there are several studies that have been published over the past few years. I did what I hope is a definitive study, which I have still not published. But I have reviewed the studies to date in a review that was published about, 5 years ago. But this study, you can do a study quite quickly, doing all the data analysis for about nearly 100 people, vitamin D assessments, the sunburn assessments, all the statistics, etc. That all takes time. So I'm hoping that I will get that submitted by the end of this year.
And just for clarification, I've got a text here from Donna from Faceit. Do you really need to use an SPF 50 in the UK all year round? If the answer is yes, then please explain what is it you're protecting your skin from?
Right. Well, I don't think you do need to use a 50 in the UK all the year round. I think, again, that would depend on your skin type and how long you're going to be out in the sun, this element of common sense, which is very difficult to prescribe specifics because it varies with the situation. The benefit of using a sunscreen is primarily, in terms of its SPF, is to prevent sunburn. But I and others have shown that if you use a sunscreen, you can prevent immunosuppression in the skin, you can prevent DNA damage in the skin, you can prevent the expression of genes that degrade collagen, the MMPs that I talked about earlier, because all these things, essentially, sunburn is an inflammatory response. It's a bit like a bee sting in some ways. It's just caused by something different. And it's caused by molecules in the skin that absorb ultraviolet radiation. there aren't so many of these molecules, and as also we heard later, you absorb the UV, the molecule undergoes a structural change, and that triggers biological outcomes, and that includes sunburn, that includes skin cancer, that includes skin aging. So by blocking the amount of UV that gets into the skin, you are almost certainly reducing all that molecular damage. So there will be other benefits, and this has been demonstrated. Very impressive studies in Australia, as I mentioned, show that regular use of sunscreen over a 4 or 5 year period reduced the incidence of squamous cell carcinoma, a little bit of evidence that they have an effect on malignant melanoma, and even some on basal cell carcinoma. Those studies have been followed up now for well over a decade, and they continue to show protection. And that same pool of volunteers, and it was something like, I've forgotten the number, but several thousand people using measurements of photoaging has shown a definite reduction in people who used a sunscreen. So the trouble with demonstrating these things, it's easy to do in the laboratory, but to demonstrate a chronic effect in humans, it may take 30 years. Apart from the cost, the sheer management of such studies is almost logistically impossible. And that's the only way you can demonstrate these things in practice. But we would expect, and I call these surrogates for skin cancer or surrogates for photoaging. For example, DNA damage is the main cause of skin cancer. The production of matrix metalloproteinases is the main cause of photoaging. If you can demonstrate, as companies do, but they're not required to, that sunscreens reduce this molecular damage, it would be astonishing if they didn't reduce the long-term clinical consequences.
So, as the song goes, wear sunscreen.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope today's discussion has answered some questions for you on the role of sunscreens. I'm Anna Richardson for iiaa Live.